Let's take a look at the dynamic EQ on the console first. I think that's a good place to start. So here you can see my screen. I'm just going to go ahead and bring up the dynamic EQ on the screen, and we'll just kind of take a look at a couple of the parameters and just kind of get an idea of the general idea of what it does. Now, the dynamic EQ that the Yamaha has is in the premium rack, and you go ahead and when you want to mount a device, first you have to mount it. So you have to basically put it in and say, this is, I like to think of it as literally putting it in the rack and screwing it into the rack. You have a certain number of spaces in the console. You can literally see they have it just looking like spaces in a rack. And you have to say, I'm going to put this device in. Now, I can mount two different versions of the dynamic EQ. I can mount a dual one, which gives me two mono dynamic EQs, or I can also mount a stereo one. Essentially, that just means that it's two channels, but they'll track together with the same settings. So if I have a stereo source that I want to run through, then I want to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and put a dual one in for right now. And so then that puts that guy up there. If I hit it, then I actually get the full screen and I get to see the various settings for the dynamic EQ. Now, the standard dynamic EQ that's in this premium rack is essentially a two-band dynamic EQ. And the way that this works, the idea is that it's kind of a combination of an equalizer and a compressor, in that rather than having an equalizer where you're cutting out, a certain amount of 3K or something, and then no matter how loud or soft that sound is, it's still cutting out that 3K. You have a situation where you want the 3K to dip down when the sound gets past a certain threshold. The signal gets past a certain threshold, but otherwise you want it to stay the same. So there's a low band here and there's a high band here, and then essentially you can, in this section, you can decide, I'm going to go ahead and make it visible so you can kind of see it. Much like an equalizer, you have the ability to change the Q, so you can make it wider or narrower. You have the ability to change the frequency, and as is true with pretty much all Yamaha EQs and things that involve frequency filters, just because it's on the low band doesn't mean you're stuck in the low band. You can put it all the way up here, and you can take the pink one, and if you wanted to put it all the way down there, you can. I find that a little counterintuitive, but you can do it. But this does mean that you can do some very unique things like this if you wanted to do, or whatever. You can change the filter type. Let's just go back to this blue guy. Let's get rid of the pink one, and let's just take a look at the blue one. And I'm going to go ahead and bring the frequency down. But just like any equalizer, you also have the ability to say, I want a shelf, or I want a high shelf, or I want kind of a standard parametric filter. And then, I can change the Q and make it wider or narrower. And then I can also change the ratio, which essentially, because it's a compressor, just means it's going to go deeper. I can change the attack and release times. Generally, I put it on fast attack because it's pretty transparent. And then I can also do this weird thing where it's actually acting as an expander. I almost never use that, but it's there. So let's run some signal through one of these and give a listen to kind of what it does.
More people than ever.
Okay, so what we're listening to is a Podium microphone for
and his boss, the
kind of standard corporate event that I recorded, and this Podium mic has some peaks in it and some P-pops and some other things. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and insert this dynamic EQ on. That is channel 3. It's even labeled Podium. And I'll insert that on the Podium. So now, and I'm going to go ahead and double check and make sure, yep, that insert is on. So now that signal is going through the premium rack.
Chairman of Fox Networks Group, really privileged to have an amazing visionary.
So there is a really good P-pop right there. So let's take a look at what we can do if we can make that P-pop be a little bit less gross.
An amazing group are really privileged to have. An amazing group are really privileged to have. An amazing group are really privileged.
Yeah, that's an annoying amount. I'm going to make it a little bit wider.
His own group are really privileged. Chairman of Fox Network. Chairman of Fox Network. One who has. Chairman of Fox Network.
All right, I promise I won't make you listen to this same phrase over and over again, but it's got a real nice P-pop in it right there. So I'm going to just bypass this. Well, let's just take a listen to that little section without my mic on so we can really hear what's going on there.
Amazing visionary in his own light, and someone who has chairman of Fox Networks Group. We're really privileged to have an amazing visionary in his own light, and someone who has chairman of Fox Networks Group. We're really privileged to have an amazing visionary.
Okay, so apologies to anybody that had their headphones turned up really loud and they're like, that just caved my head in with that amount of P-pop. I apologize, but it gives you an idea of just how, bad especially a lectern mic can P-pop, and it's a problem that we face all the time. So one of the great ways to use a dynamic EQ, and this was taught, I'd love to say I came up with this, but this was taught to me by a friend, is to go ahead and put the filter type on basically a low shelf and put a good amount of ratio and basically put it so it's got a pretty good bit of dip to it, and then just set the threshold so that it's really only triggering on those P-pops. Then you can see how much gain reduction we're getting on that low frequency when he hits that P-pop. So I'm going to take a listen to that with it in and with it out. Again, watch your ears if you've got your headphones really loud, so we'll just hear it in and hear it out.
Privileged to have an amazing visionary in his own light, and someone who has chairman of Fox Networks Group. We're really privileged to have an amazing visionary in his own light, and someone who has chairman of Fox Networks Group. We're really privileged to have an amazing visionary in his own light, and someone who has.
Listen to it one more time with it in.
Fox Networks Group. We're really privileged to have an amazing visionary.
So I think you can hear that. Obviously, you can still hear the distorted pop in there because that signal was distorted there, but the amount of low end energy has dramatically decreased, and as a result of that, especially if you're running through a PA system, you don't get that big low end boom that happens off of a P-pop off of a microphone. So this is a great use of the dynamic EQ. So now I've dialed up an SM58. Let me make sure that that's going in the stereo bus. It is. So I'm going to go ahead and take out my normal microphone, and we'll just talk in the SM58 for a little bit. We'll use that as another live example of another thing that we can do with a dynamic EQ, another way that we can another way, sorry, I just don't glance at the chat. Another way that we can make a good use of a dynamic EQ. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing I did before. I'm going to insert this second channel of dynamic EQ into this SM58 instance, and so now you can see that I am hitting the SM58, and you can see that it is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So I'm gonna gas this up a little bit. So I'm kind of overdoing it, probably higher than I would normally do. Apologies if that's too loud in anybody's ears. So I'm gonna bypass this. I'm gonna show you, this is a trick that SM58 is not a great choice for this, but this is a trick I use a lot. Beta 87s have this even more so than a 58. But typically, when you're doing Q&A microphones for a corporate event, one of the problems you have is that people will hold it like this, and they'll hold it back. I'm about a foot away from my mouth. And one, the level's lower. You can always, goose the level up a little bit so that you compensate for that. But as soon as they do this, not only does it get louder, even if I balance the volume with the fader, which is what I just did, I just took 10 dB off the fader, you can hear suddenly the sound got really, really muddy and got really, tons and tons of low end in it. And so, you know, even though I'm balancing the volume with the fader, people talking like this, it's much thinner, and then they talk like this, and all of a sudden it gets really, really dark sounding. So one of the things that you can do is use your friend, the dynamic EQ. And you're doing the same sort of thing. You are rolling off that low end. The nice thing is that here I am holding the microphone a good distance away from my face. There's still a good bit of low end in that. Like, it's still a good sounding microphone. It doesn't sound thin. It's a good sounding microphone. But as soon as I really get up on it, that low dynamic EQ starts kicking in. And while it got louder, the low end didn't suddenly, that proximity effect that a cardioid microphone will have is far less pronounced and much smoother. I'm going to